What if I told you that one of the most powerful weapons of the Hundred Years' War wasn't the longbow or the bombard? And what if I told you it was a simple piece of parchment, and that this piece of paper was literal surviving proof that the pen can be mightier than the sword? You see, this wasn't any old scrap of paper, it was a contract that bound soldiers to the king. Today, we're going to be discussing contract indentures. These written agreements transformed the English into a lean, semi-professionalized killing machine and gave them a decisive edge over their French enemies. In fact, these contracts proved so effective that the French themselves would adopt a similar system, leading to the formation of the companies of ordnance and later the famous gendarmes. But what was a contract indenture and how did it get its name? The answer to the second question might surprise you, but we'll get to that in just a minute. A contract indenture was a contract made between the crown and a military captain. We'll examine a real contract in a little bit, but basically the contract specifies the number and type of soldiers a captain is required to bring. It would also outline how long they were to serve for and at what pay, as well as providing basic guidelines for their equipment and also rules for the sharing of plunder and prisoners. Oh, and it was called a contract indenture because of the indented line along the contract, where it was folded and torn in half. Each party would keep half, and to prove that the contract was authentic, you'd place the two halves together, and if they fit, it was considered legitimate. But how could a piece of paper be a decisive factor against armored knights? And in large part because the alternative was chaos. The French relied heavily on the arrière-ban, which was a type of feudal call to arms. This would summon able-bodied men to join the army, but often for a relatively short period of 40 days. After this, some would go home and the remainder would demand payment for their services. In addition, some lords might arrive late or not at all if they were having a dispute with the king, or they just thought it wasn't in their best interest to show up and weren't particularly afraid of repercussions that would follow. Moreover, while the arrière-ban would summon a large number of well-equipped knights and men-at-arms, it would also summon a large number of commoners. These commoners were largely inexperienced and poorly equipped, but they still needed to be fed, disciplined, and maneuvered around the battlefield of the campaign, which was a massive expenditure of resources. In return, their actual value on the battlefield was pretty questionable at best. In comparison, the contract indenture system ensured that the English armies were mostly comprised of men selected by their captains. Captains were held responsible for the quality of their men and in return were promised a fixed and quite generous wage for their service, as well as guaranteed portions of plunder and ransoms. In addition, the contract system would help clarify command and control, as we'll see when we examine a contract in a minute. In the words of the historian Anne Curry, the indenture system allowed for an army that was more cohesive, better disciplined, and more capable of extended campaigning. With that said, let's discuss the major benefits of the contract indenture system, starting with the fact that it was outside of the feudal obligations. Now, why would being outside of the feudal obligation system be a benefit, you might ask? And, well, I think we have a tendency to oversimplify the feudal system into a kind of the king commands and so it is done system, and that's just not the case. In England especially, there was a strong belief that lords had rights and that the king could not infringe on these rights. This is recorded by Walter of Guisborough in an argument about military service between King Edward I and the Earl of Norfolk, who was refusing to serve in Gascony away from the king, who wanted to launch a second front in northern France, and the Earl starts by saying, "With you will I gladly go, O king, in front of you in the first line of battle, as belongs to me by hereditary right." And we can see here that he is clearly citing his feudal obligations and duties, but also standing up for what he views as being his rights. And King Edward responds with, "You will go without me too, with the others." To which the Earl just says, "I am not bound, neither is it my will." And at this point, the king actually threatens to hang the Earl, to which the Earl simply replies, "By the same oath, I will neither go nor hang." And this is quite clearly, we see Norfolk standing up for not only his rights, but also citing the feudal contract in his argument. And while he was relieved from his post of marshal, he was not otherwise punished, and certainly he was not hanged for this. Notably, he was joined in his refusal to serve by 4 other powerful English earls. This refusal to fight away from the king in France was a major problem that made the feudal levy system almost useless for English kings. If they wanted to invade Normandy, which was historically Plantagenet lands, at the same time, they needed another army to defend their existing lands in Gascony. The contract indenture system bypasses this problem since it places military service under contract with its own set of rewards and outside of the feudal system. So let's take a look at an actual contract from the year 1415. This contract is between King Henry V and Sir Thomas Tunstall, who's a minor knight. I'm not going to read the entire contract, but I'll link it below and summarize the key points here. However, right off, we see that Sir Thomas is contracted to provide 6 men-at-arms, including himself, and 18 mounted archers, once again showing how the contract system allows the king to dictate the composition of his army in a way that the feudal levy just doesn't. Pay is clearly a major issue, and the first 3 paragraphs are regarding wages and payments. Notably, we see that the rates of pay may vary depending on whether the captain and his men are serving with different rates for Gascony as opposed to fighting in France, or if they're serving with the king as opposed to fighting away from the king. We also see that Sir Thomas is promised a quote-unquote regard, which is essentially a bonus for each quarter that he serves with the king's army, and this is a way for the king to encourage his captains to continue loyal service, as if they do, they'll get paid a nice bonus. The 4th paragraph is critical in establishing command and control. It requires Sir Thomas to, quote, muster men of his retinue before such a person or persons as it may please the Lord King to appoint and assign. This neatly deals with the questions of feudal rank and social status by allowing the king to deploy his contracted army to fight where and under the command of whoever he so desires. This is a big leap forward because, as you saw in the argument between the king and the Earl of Norfolk, English lords under the feudal system could simply refuse to serve if it wasn't with the king. The 4th paragraph also states that his men will be, quote, well mounted, armed, and arrayed as appropriate to their rank. This feels kind of vague to a modern scholar, but at the time it was clearly well understood because it's wording that's used on all contracts from Crécy to Agincourt. We know that this must have been a pretty high standard because both English and French chroniclers remark on how well harnessed and equipped the English were. The last paragraph deals with the dividing of spoils and prisoners. It allows the King of England to demand control of any royal prisoners, which is basically the king or his male relations. It also promises that he will duly reward whatever soldier took that prisoner, and it entitles the king to 1/3 of Sir Thomas's plunder, as well as 1/3 of the third of his men's plunder. This is important because war was an expensive business, and at least on a small level, this ensured that the English would be able to recoup some of their expenses. So what we can see here is a semi-professionalized contract that is highly beneficial to both sides. For the king, the contract allows him to assign Sir Thomas to serve wherever he is needed, under whatever commander the king desires, and it also entitles the king to a percentage of his spoils. Moreover, it allows the king to dictate the composition of his army, ensuring that every single soldier will fulfill a valuable battlefield role. For Sir Thomas and his men, the contract guarantees them a set rate of pay, it guarantees the men-at-arms a bonus, and reaffirms their right to a substantial share of the spoils. As a former soldier myself, knowing that I will get paid and when I'll be paid is one of the most important things from a morale perspective, so both sides really stand to benefit here. As we stated at the start, the feudal levy generated a large mass of men with very different levels of fighting capabilities. This created a very large logistical footprint since everyone had to eat, and after 40 days or so, everyone needed to be paid. When it came to actual battle, a decent amount of the men that you were feeding and paying were of pretty questionable overall quality. Moreover, an army like the French, with a large number of knights and men-at-arms, would require substantial logistical support for their many horses. A knight might have 3 to 4 horses for campaign, a man-at-arms 2 and maybe 3. Comparatively, the contract indenture system allows the king to specify the number and type of soldiers in his army, thereby ensuring that every man will fit into the army's overall battlefield strategy. In addition, because English armies are skewed in favor of archers, the logistical footprint from horses is much less. A mounted longbowman probably just had one horse for riding around. This all makes for a leaner, easier to supply army that is much more efficient on the battlefield. Having a set army composition also allows the king to design tactics and issue orders preemptively before battle is joined. In most of the major campaigns, the English clearly seek out certain types of battlefields where they can limit the field and fight from elevation. They routinely make use of battlefield fortifications and obstacles such as pits, holes, sharpened stakes, etc. to hinder and slow the French advance. From these factors, we could say that the contract indenture system really helped to pave the way for modern professional armies. This system produced an English army that, while smaller, was much better organized, easier to command and control, and consisted of soldiers who each played a critical role in the army's overall strategy. And we see this play out in every major English victory. In almost every case, the English outmaneuver the French and are able to select the battlefield on which they fight. In each case, they select a field that is highly advantageous towards their army composition. In each battle, the English exhibit high levels of cohesion, discipline, and all elements of the English army contribute a great deal to the victory, whether that's the men-at-arms holding the battle line, or it's the longbowmen shooting arrows or charging into the melee from the flanks. They all play a critical role, and you can compare that to the French. They levy a large number of troops, but then they struggle with commanding and controlling that large mass of men. We often see this large but difficult to control army getting caught up in premature charges and other such mistakes, and we also see that the French infantry, despite being thousands strong, is really unable to make any sort of impact on the battle. Notably, the French learn and adapt, and we see the formation of more contracted companies within the French army, such as the companies of ordnance and later the gendarmes. These are the next step towards a professional army, since instead of being raised on shorter contracts, these men were generally contracted over a longer period and created a sort of semi-standing army. So I hope what you got from this video is a new insight into all of the different things administratively that could go into winning a war before the first battle is even fought. And the next time you think about warfare, remember that sometimes the pen really is mightier than the sword. If you'd like to learn more about England's enemies, the French men-at-arms, click on the video linked here. And if you enjoy this type of content, go ahead and hit the subscribe and notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. With that said, take care until the next time.